In the summer of 1888, in the mist-covered hills of Shimla, British India's summer capital, something dark was happening behind the walls of the grandest colonial mansions. 3 children had vanished in 3 months. All from wealthy British families. All between the ages of 7 and 10. All without a single trace. The British authorities searched everywhere. Scotland Yard sent their finest inspector. The Viceroy himself demanded answers, yet the children remained lost, as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. But there was one person watching, listening, and understanding things that the British investigators could never comprehend. Her name was Meera Devi, and she was just an ayah, a nanny, in the eyes of colonial society invisible, unimportant. Beneath notice. That invisibility would become her greatest weapon. This is, The Echoes of Shimla, a story about the woman who saw what others refused to see, who heard what others tried to silence, and who solved a mystery that the entire British Empire could not. Before we continue, this is a work of historical fiction inspired by the real experiences of countless invisible women who served in colonial households and witnessed history from the shadows. Their stories were never recorded, but they deserve to be imagined. Meera Devi was born in 1853 in a small village near Lucknow. Her father was a munshi, a clerk, who worked for a British trading company. Unlike most girls of her time, Meera received an education. Her father taught her to read and write in Hindi, Urdu, and eventually, English. He believed knowledge was the only inheritance he could give his daughter that no one could take away. He was wrong about one thing: they could take everything else. In 1857, when Meera was just 4 years old, the Great Uprising swept through North India. Her father was accused of passing information to the freedom fighters. Whether the accusation was true or false, it didn't matter. The British needed examples, they needed fear. Meera never saw her father again. Her mother, broken by grief, took young Meera to the hills, to Shimla, where she found work as a domestic servant in British households. She taught Meera the most important lesson of survival in colonial India. Become invisible. The less they see you, the safer you are. Watch everything, say nothing, survive. Meera learned this lesson too well. By the time she was a teenager, she could move through a room full of British officers and their wives without anyone registering her presence. She learned to read expressions, to notice small details, to understand what people really meant when their words said something else. The British called this quality native intuition, and dismissed it as some sort of primitive instinct. They never understood what it really was: the sharpened perception of someone who had learned that survival depended on seeing danger before it arrived. By 1888, Meera had worked in British households for over 2 decades. She was now the head ayah in the household of Colonel Frederick Whitmore, one of the most respected military officers in British India. Her primary responsibility was caring for the colonel's grandson, 8-year-old Thomas. Thomas was different from the other British children Meera had cared for. He didn't treat her as invisible. He asked her questions about India, about her life, about the stories and songs she knew. He called her Meera Auntie when his parents weren't listening, and she had come to love him as if he were her own. It was this love that would draw her into the most dangerous investigation of her life. On the evening of September 14, 1888, Thomas Whitmore disappeared from the garden of his grandfather's mansion. He had been playing there just moments before, watched by a young maidservant who had looked away for barely a minute. When she turned back, he was gone. The investigation that followed was unlike anything Shimla had ever seen. Inspector Gerald Morrison, sent specially from Calcutta, took over the case. He was a large man with a red face and an even redder temper, and he made no secret of his suspicion that the kidnappings were the work of the natives. Within days, a dozen Indian servants from various households had been arrested and interrogated. Several were beaten. One, a gardener named Raju who worked at a neighboring estate, died from his injuries. The British community demanded justice, by which they meant punishment, regardless of evidence. Meera watched all of this with growing horror. She knew these servants, she knew they were innocent. More importantly, she was beginning to notice things that Inspector Morrison either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. The 3 kidnapped children, Thomas, and before him, Elizabeth Harrington and James Crawford, had something in common beyond their British parentage. Each of their families had arrived in Shimla within the last 2 years. Each family had acquired significant property and wealth in suspicious circumstances, and each family had connections to a particular gentleman's club called the Himalayan Society. The Himalayan Society was one of the most exclusive clubs in colonial India. Its members were the highest ranks of British colonial administration, military officers, civil servants, and wealthy merchants. They met every Thursday evening in a mansion at the edge of town, and what happened in those meetings was never discussed publicly. Meera had served at those meetings before. 3 years ago, when she had briefly worked in the household that hosted these gatherings, she had overheard fragments of conversations talk of acquisitions and arrangements, laughter that stopped suddenly when servants entered the room, documents quickly hidden when anyone approached. At the time, she had filed away these observations without understanding their significance. Now, with Thomas missing, the fragments began to form a terrible pattern. Meera began her own investigation, using the only advantages she had, her invisibility and her memory. She visited the households of the other missing children under the pretext of paying respects. In each house, she noticed the same small details: expensive new furniture that didn't match the family's supposed income, servants who spoke in whispers and avoided certain rooms, a particular tension between husbands and wives that suggested secrets too heavy to bear. She also noticed what was missing: family photographs that had been removed from walls, leaving clean rectangles, and the dust letters that had been burned in fireplaces but not completely destroyed. She found fragments in ash bins, account books that had pages torn out. When she compiled these observations in her mind, the picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. These families were not ordinary colonial administrators. They were involved in something else. Something that required secrecy, something that generated enormous wealth, and something that had made them targets for someone seeking revenge. Meera could not investigate openly. A native servant asking questions about the activities of powerful British families would face immediate consequences. But she had another network available to her, the invisible army of servants who moved through every colonial household in Shimla. She began reaching out to ayahs, cooks, gardeners, and cleaning staff across the station. She met them at the market, at the temple, at the water pump, where servants gathered to share news. And slowly, carefully, she began to assemble information. The cook from the Harrington household told her that the master had recently received a large shipment of goods from Calcutta, goods that were transferred at night and stored in a locked room that servants were forbidden to enter. The gardener at the Crawford estate mentioned that his master had been making frequent trips to a particular valley 3 hours' ride from Shimla, always returning late at night with mud on his boots that didn't match any soil in the immediate area. And the coachman who served the Himalayan Society revealed the most disturbing detail of all: there was a fifth family, one whose child had also disappeared, but the case had never been reported to police. The family had left Shimla immediately, and all record of them seemed to have vanished. The pattern crystallized in Meera's mind: these families were not random victims, they were participants in some enterprise that had made them targets, and whoever was taking the children was not an opportunistic kidnapper. This was calculated, planned, and purposeful. But who had the motivation for such precise vengeance? And more importantly, where were the children? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Old Kamala, a sweeper woman who had worked in Shimla for over 40 years, remembered something when Meera described the mud on Crawford's boots. "That red clay," Kamala said, her ancient eyes distant with memory. "I've only seen that color once before in the valley of Jakku, where the old temples are. There was a village there once before the British came. The British wanted the land for a hunting lodge. The villagers refused to leave. Then one night the village burned. Everyone said it was an accident, but..." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Meera understood now. The families in the Himalayan Society had been involved in acquiring lands through displacement and violence. Somewhere someone had survived those acquisitions. Someone was now taking from those families what those families had taken from them. The children were not dead, they were being held as leverage or perhaps as proof, but they were alive. Meera felt certain of this. She had to find them before Inspector Morrison's investigation convicted innocent servants, or before whoever was holding the children decided that leverage was no longer necessary. Meera made her way to the Jakku Valley on foot, leaving before dawn and arriving as the sun set. It was a difficult journey for a woman alone, but she had learned long ago that the roads held fewer dangers for an invisible ayah than for a visible British officer. What she found confirmed Kamala's story: the ruins of a village, overgrown but still visible foundations of houses, a temple, half collapsed, and signs of recent activity, fresh footprints, the remains of cooking fires, and voices carrying faintly on the evening air. She approached carefully, using every skill of invisibility her mother had taught her, and there, in a cave behind the ruined temple, she found them. Thomas, Elizabeth, James, all 3 children were alive. sitting around a small fire, eating what appeared to be a meal of rice and vegetables. Watching over them was an old man, thin, weathered, with a face that held centuries of grief and a lifetime of patience. "You're not with them," the old man said, seeing Mira emerge from the shadows. "You're a servant. You have our eyes." "I have no one's eyes but my own," Mira replied, "and I've come for the children." The old man shook his head slowly. "I mean them no harm. I only want what was taken: my village, my family, my life. These children are the only language their fathers understand. I will return them when justice is done." "And if justice never comes?" Mira asked. "These children are innocent. They were not yet born when your village burned." "The children of the serpent are not innocent," the old man said, but there was doubt in his voice. Mira did something that surprised even herself. She sat down across from the old man and asked him to tell his story, not because she needed information, but because she understood that some wounds only begin to heal when they are witnessed. His name was Pratap. He had been a young man when the British came with papers saying they had purchased his village. When the villagers refused to leave, soldiers came at night. Fire was set. His parents, his wife, his 2 children, all lost in the flames. He alone escaped, burned and broken, to spend decades as a wandering ascetic, watching the families who had profited from his destruction build their comfortable lives. "I wanted them to know," Pratap said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I wanted them to feel even a fraction of what I felt when I lost everyone, but I could never hurt these little ones. They remind me too much of my own children. I only wanted their fathers to pay attention, to acknowledge what was done." Mira saw the truth in his eyes. This was not a kidnapper in the conventional sense. This was a survivor driven mad by grief and seeking not violence but acknowledgement. "Let me take them back," she said, "and I will ensure your story is told." "They will never listen," Pratap replied. "The British hear only what they wish to hear." "Then I will make them listen," Mira said. "I have seen things in my years of service. I know things, and I know there are those among the British who still have conscience. Let me try. It is more than you will achieve through holding children." The story of Mira Devi, as I have told it here, is a work of fiction, but it is inspired by 1,000 true stories that were never recorded. In every colonial household, there were servants who witnessed history, women who overheard conversations that decided the fates of nations, men who carried secrets that their masters never suspected they understood, children who watched atrocities and carried those memories into adulthood, passing them down as whispered warnings to future generations. The British kept meticulous records of their activities, but those records tell only one side of history. The other side, the perspective of the colonized, the observations of the invisible, was rarely written down. It survived in oral traditions, in family stories, in collective memory that academics are only now beginning to take seriously. Mira Devi represents all of these unrecorded witnesses: the sharp eyes that noticed what was not supposed to be seen, the sharp minds that analyzed patterns that the powerful thought were hidden, the sharp memories that held on to truths that the powerful wanted forgotten. She represents the power of invisibility turned into the power of observation, the power of silence turned into the power of understanding, the power of being dismissed turned into the power of moving freely through spaces that others could not enter. History has forgotten most of these witnesses, but their observations, passed down through generations, shaped how communities understood their own experiences under colonialism. In a sense, every freedom movement, every act of resistance, every assertion of dignity was informed by the accumulated wisdom of countless invisible women and men who saw everything and forgot nothing. So the next time you read a history book, ask yourself, whose perspective is missing? Who was in the room but not recorded in the minutes? Who served the tea while empires were planned and lives were traded? The invisible ones saw everything, and their echoes still resonate today. This was The Echoes of Shimla, an original historical fiction created to honor the unrecorded witnesses of colonial history. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who appreciates untold perspectives on history.